I now can take a 100-page research paper that we have created, and out of it, I can produce 5 to 10 ancillary products. And that was really wonderful, not just because we got those 5 outcomes, but because we essentially wound up planting 5 seeds across the organization.
Welcome to Sidecar Sync, your weekly dose of innovation. If you're looking for the latest news, insights, and developments in the association world, especially those driven by artificial intelligence, you're in the right place. We cut through the noise to bring you the most relevant updates with a keen focus on how AI and other emerging technologies are shaping the future. No fluff, just facts and informed discussions. I'm Amith Nagarajan, chairman of Blue Cypress, and I'm your host.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Sidecar Sync podcast. My name is Mallory Mejias, and I am one of your co-hosts along with Amith Nagarajan. Today, we have a special edition episode of the Sidecar Sync lined up for you with an interview with Bill Jewell. A little bit of info on Bill. He serves as the Chief Information Officer at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, where he leads technology and information security programs. His role encompasses developing technology platforms and services that support the Chamber's operations. Previously, Bill was the Chief Information Security Officer and Vice President of Technology at the College Board, safeguarding data for over 100 million individuals. Bill has been recognized for his contributions to technology and security in the educational and nonprofit sectors, earning accolades such as being a finalist for the Capital Orbi CIO of the Year Award. We've got a special conversation lined up for you where we talk about the power of artificial intelligence to improve the efficiency and the quality of your work. We talk about empowering the people within your organization to experiment and encouraging bottom-up innovation within your organization. Of course, we talk about managing risks. And finally, we talk about the necessity of focusing your energies on policies, principles, and people within your business. We'll dive right into that interview after a quick word from our sponsor. Today's sponsor is Sidecar's AI Learning Hub. The AI Learning Hub is your go-to place to sharpen your AI skills and ensure you're keeping up with the latest in the AI space. When you purchase access to the AI Learning Hub, you get a library of on-demand AI lessons that are regularly updated to reflect what's new and the latest in the AI space. You also get access to live weekly office hours with AI experts. And finally, you get to join a community of fellow AI enthusiasts who are just as excited about learning about this emerging technology as you are. You can purchase 12-month access to the AI Learning Hub for $399. And if you want to get more information on that, you can go to sidecarglobal.com/hub. Bill, thank you so much for joining us today. Could you share a little bit with our listeners about your background and what brings you to this moment?
I am currently the CIO for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I've been working in sort of the technology space, largely for nonprofits, mainly for education and in the education space for the last 25 years or so.
So Bill and I were introduced about 2 months ago by a mutual colleague in the association space. And the connection was made because that colleague had attended a session Bill had presented all about AI and AI for associations, nonprofits. And so he and I connected after that because, as you know, Mallory, there's not a ton of people doing a lot with AI in our space. And so whenever I hear of someone doing something cool, I very quickly try to connect with them and say, hey, what's going on? What are you up to? What's going well? What's broken? All that kind of stuff. So Bill and I had a really fun get acquainted type conversation that's led to some more discussion. And really appreciate you being here today, Bill, and joining us to chat and share your experiences. Really at the intersection of associations, artificial intelligence, but innovation more broadly as well, and talk about some of the things that you're excited about, things that you're challenged by, that kind of stuff. So by way of background, I just wanted to link us all up, and so our listeners know how we got together. Maybe you can share just a tiny bit about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and a little background on what the organization does. Most people, I think, have heard of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, but don't necessarily know really what its mission is and what you focus on day to day over there.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been around for over 100 years. It is the nation's sort of leading business advocacy organization. We represent businesses large and small from across the country. We also have a very large international component where we are doing work for our members to make sure they can be successful globally. I appreciate you sort of making the connection of how we got together. One of the things that we do a lot of work in the AI space. And so I agree there are many associations out there, and some of them are not probably doing a lot in this area because it is so new, but we are trying to leading both on the policy front to sort of make sure that as AI regulations are being discussed and proposed, that business has a strong voice in those, that the work that we do in this area manages risk the right way, and make sure that ethical standards are in place in the right way, and that, again, business is sort of well represented so that they can be a spot where America leads. But we also do a lot of work with other associations and chambers of commerce to help them sort of help them where we can and learn from them where we can on these topics.
What was the name of your session that you led about AI and associations? I'm very curious.
Yeah, I mean, again, so we have a large, like I said, policy and advocacy arm, a lot of which does focus on issues like AI. I think the name of my thing had something to do with sort of like practical applications for AI. And the reason I mentioned that is because there is a lot of work going on and a lot more discussion going on across the field to talk about the risks, the policies, the future, all of the really fancy, fun stuff going on with AI and generative AI and specifically. But I don't hear a lot of talk about practical applications. So I am personally by no means, there are not lots of experts in the world in this space, but I am certainly not an expert in where this technology is going to go in 25 years, or the sort of biggest issues as it relates to privacy, policy, ethics. I certainly think about them quite a bit. Where I want to talk about more is like, what can we do today? What can you do next week? What can you do in a month that's going to help you take what's available today and get value out of it? And it's a very different kind of conversation that I don't think a lot of people are really having.
I love that viewpoint because so much of the flurry of interest and concern around AI is about the future, and yet there are so many things you can do right now. So I think that that'd be a great place to start our conversation is maybe within the chamber, what would be the top practical use case that you have seen business value from already?
Yeah, I would put it into two. So if we're talking generative AI more specifically than just AI broadly, which is what most people are talking about these days when they talk about AI, I put this into kind of two categories, and there's certainly more, and those categories can be broken down a lot. But one has to do with just the area of generalized efficiency and quality, right? We know there are studies that are coming out that are beginning to prove, and we know just intuitively that these tools will allow employees to do things a little bit faster and improve the quality of those things that they do if they are done smartly and with care, right? So part one is about just making sure that our employees and others who want to use these technologies are empowered to do so in a way that risk is managed appropriately, and that they are doing so smartly in ways that they can get value from. So perhaps we can get some percentage bump in efficiency and some percentage bump in quality over key tasks. And they're not just always rote tasks. They could be ways of making people ask different kinds of questions, think a little bit differently about things, but also just like trim time off of some of these rote tasks. The other category that I'd put things into is unlocking insights that may not be as easy to come by with just our normal routine processes of like looking at the internet, reading books, evaluating data in spreadsheets, right? If we can unlock different types of insights, we can generate new products, we can generate new ways of serving our members across any number of associations. So those are the two categories I'd put them in, and we've done a little bit in both.
Okay. That's super interesting. And I think you kind of frame it in a way where when you think about the gains that you're seeking, to maybe start off with a modest expectation as opposed to the hype cycle that's out there where people are saying that, all these jobs are going to be eliminated overnight. And not everyone's saying that literally, but people are very much up in these conversations where they're saying 80% of the work will go away. And it sounds like what you're talking about are practical, hands-on things you can do now that might shave 10, 20, 30, 40% off maybe, and which is meaningful, it's significant, but perhaps more modest than some of the headline type things that people are thinking about. Is that, are you intentionally trying to have kind of that pragmatic type of focus and try to look for applications that are perhaps also lower risk, but are kind of more bite-sized incremental reward?
Yeah. I would love some of these moonshot projects too, that would have the sort of organizational transformational work. But again, I think the space that we're in with the maturity of the technology that exists today and the general nature of how associations think about technology, those incremental gains are available today. Like right now, you can get them. And so if I've emphasized one area when I talk with all of our teams and do workshops, it's like helping people find those, because there aren't, I don't think in our space, IT organizations that are able to take on really big projects that would require really large investments in data quality, sure. and engineering and operations to do something beyond that in most cases. And so we have to be really selective. It doesn't mean that can't happen. It doesn't mean we're not working on a couple of them. But when I started this process, one of the things we did was try to just identify the use cases. And there are many, many that you can think of. And we did that. And in many cases, and I think in order to be effective in this role, you have to create focus. And so you have to pick what you're going to invest in. And we really just stacked these use cases up against what's feasible today, what's feasible today, what's the right risk we're willing to take on today, and what kind of impact is this going to have? And so that's, we had to be thoughtful about all those things as we go ahead and say, which ones are we going to invest in? But those incremental ones they're quite easy, right? I mean, if you can pick a tool that people can use and educate people on how to use that tool smartly and securely, I'm not going to be successful if I take on the work trying to make everyone's job 5, 10, 25% more efficient. But if I can get them to really understand the parameters and the opportunities that exist within that space, they can do it themselves.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. And look, I think that, momentum is built with lots of small incremental gains. Usually there's certainly some step functions that exist in the world where you can, radically accelerate. But most people don't take well to that. Even if it's an exciting form of acceleration, it's just hard because, there's a lot of inertia around process, and all of us think in a certain way based on our conditioning for however long we've been alive. So, I think that the idea of a 10% improvement in productivity is worth just pausing on for a second, which is a lower number than most people talk about. Like the Boston Consulting Group study that came out in the fall that talked about a 20 to 25% increase across the board for most knowledge workers and a 40% increase in productivity for less experienced knowledge workers was super interesting. And of course, that's a bigger number. But if we just zoom back to 10% and say, okay, well, what does 10% mean? If we have a 40-hour work week, it's 4 hours a week. It's half of a day that we get back. And we can choose to invest that time however makes the most sense. And it's even more astounding over the course of a 2,000-hour work year when you say, okay, we're going to get 200 hours back. That starts to add up, especially when you multiply it across dozens or potentially hundreds of employees. And I think that math is subtle, but it's very powerful. And I think there's plenty of applications out there where we can grab 10, even 20% of our time back and then reinvest it in other thinking. Certainly all the usual use cases people talk about, like summarizing documents, creating first drafts, being a creative partner in image or video editing and generation, all that type of stuff. We've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about those topics. But I like the point you made about empowering the users so that they can figure out how to apply the tool. We also spend a lot of time talking about that and describing ways to approach it. Have you found a particular approach, Bill, that you've seen good results with to get users excited about learning AI and learning whatever the tool is?
I think it has to be multi-pronged. So we've taken a lot of approaches, and I'm not sure that I can say which one has worked better than others. But so first of all, we had to define the tool set that we were going to enable and empower people on. And once we did that, we did a lot of different things, right? We had all hands meetings. We have a bunch of internal communications and emails and resources on our intranet. We have, I do maybe 1 or 2 workshops per week where I'm just, a team will invite me in, I will talk with them. I really like the hands-on nature of a workshop rather than me just sort of saying, here's things you can do. I give the group tasks. I put them in little 2 or 3 person teams. They work on these really, really small tasks, but when they start seeing these incremental gains, that's when they get a little more involved in that. We also did a hackathon across the organization, and it was not your typical hackathon. A typical hackathon in the IT realm is going to look like a lot of application developers, swarming around a specific set of technologies and problems and developing prototypes with working code of applications. I didn't want to make it IT focused, and I don't think associations can effectively do that because they don't have 25 application developers to form these teams. We did it as an organization where we got people from across teams who are not as technical together. So I would pair someone with an IT background with our comms team, our policy teams, our research teams, and gave them a day and a half, right? Basically, they weren't trying to design working code. They were trying to design reusable prompts and repeatable processes for those prompts that could get those Boston Consulting study type of outcomes. Like, this is a thing we could do that would save our team 25% on this task. And they did. It was and they did, right? Out of that thing, we had 5 teams, 5 different reusable tools that individuals could go out and say, I now can take 100-page or 75-page or 100-page research paper that we have created, and out of it, I can produce 5 to 10 ancillary products in very rough draft form, and that's going to save us X number of hours a week. And that was really wonderful, not just because we got those 5 outcomes, but because we essentially wound up planting 5 seeds across the organization. As much as I can go out and do workshops, a top-down approach, which is important, isn't sufficient. I think getting some of that support from across the organization is good. I mean, there's nothing is going to be more effective than seeing your coworker doing something a lot faster than you and hearing them explain why. That is going to be motivating.
Totally agree. I mean, that's been the experience we've had across our businesses and certainly in working with a lot of different associations. And getting those ideas to be generated by people so they have ownership of them, I think, is an important concept. There's more creativity being enabled by AI than ever before. And while on the one hand, there's obviously efficiency and automation opportunities with this technology, there's also opportunities for people to think more creatively if they think of AI as this kind of empowering, enabling tool. And you're totally right. Like this idea of traditional hackathons where you have developers working together and writing code, that concept, applying it to other things where you just essentially pulling people away from their day-to-day so they have a little bit of creative freedom. Whereas, most people in their daily work, they're on their email, they're in their systems, they're doing the pattern that's been well established, and that the water flows through the Grand Canyon in a predictable path because it's been going that way for a long, long time. And sometimes you want to stir things up. And so I think a hackathon type idea is really powerful. We've done them in a lot of organizations, and they're not always for coders. Certainly coding hackathons are great, but the idea of doing it in the marketing department or doing it cross-departmentally the way you described, I think can inspire a lot of people. Did you have any folks coming out of there like really gung-ho saying, hey, we want to keep working like this in the hackathon and doing other things kind of organically across the organization post-hackathon?
We did. We certainly got a lot of positive response. We got a lot of enthusiasm. My team certainly came out immediately saying we want to do this again. It was also just good for connecting your IT team with other parts of the business, right? It's very easy in our day-to-day jobs to get focused on tech support and operating a CRM, but making those connections is good. We also got other teams, like we're going to do a second one. We're getting a lot of people wanting to be a part of it. And it's good. You mentioned something when you were asking that question about the importance of like creativity. And I think that's like an area to focus on too. This technology, it's technology, so a lot of the same rules apply to any technology about security and governance and all those other things. But there are other parts of this that I'm sure you've experienced with a lot of people where this technology just feels a little bit different than others. It's a great opportunity to reinforce with people the importance of like experimenting, embracing failure, being resilient. Like you don't want to do things so wildly that you create a security issue or that you create inefficiencies. But this is the type of technology that really lets people understand like trial and error. When I'll do a workshop, there will be some people who will type in a prompt and get an answer that's a little bit weird or unhelpful. And that's kind of like that's deflating. And then there are others that just see that, try again. The fourth time you do it and you see something incredible happen, it just becomes so much more intuitive. But that like perseverance, that curiosity, that ability to fail and move on very, very quickly is really going to be one of those important differentiating skills of teams as they work with this technology more and more.
Bill, you've mentioned security and data privacy and topics like that, are definitely top of mind for us here. And I know Mallory has some questions for you in that realm prepared, but I want to zoom in a little bit more on the creativity topic because I don't want to leave that quite yet. People think of computers and computer programs as being very predictable. You put something in, you get something out. And a big shift that's happening with, generative AI in particular is you can't really expect the same outcome every time, the way these models work. And that makes it difficult for some people to wrap their heads around, along the lines of the example you gave of, hey, you try something a few different times, perhaps a few different ways, or maybe you just tried the same thing a few different times and you get slightly different outcomes. Do you have any guidance for how people, whether it's CIOs or just business leaders in general, how they should think about these types of programs? They're ultimately computer programs, but they work differently. They're not deterministic. They have different outcomes based on a variety of things. When people, sometimes I talk to people, they're like, yeah, we can't really rely on it because it's variable, as opposed to like in my ERP, if I run my financial statement, I want it to work the exact same way every single time, right? And this is a different context. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit and your experience there.
Yeah. And again, I'll just start again by saying you and I are talking mainly about generative AI here, where instead of other kinds of tools, although it is variable in other contexts. But this is where context really matters and really understanding. I don't know what all the employees do on their day-to-day jobs, and I don't know the importance of creativity versus precision in all of their work. That's why it's so important for a CIO or anyone trying to roll this out to make people to help people to understand what generative AI is and what it is not. I can't answer the question, is this reliable enough? Is it reliable enough yet? it's a very context specific question, right? So to your point, about like a financial statement, I wouldn't load in all the invoices and budgets that teams have submitted into an LLM and ask it to write me my 2024 financial audit. Nor would I go into an operating room as a doctor and say, hey, give me the steps for doing a brain surgery, right? Like terrible risk profile, terrible idea. But if it's about generating text that you are going to then review and edit, that's wonderful, right? It's gonna give you huge advantages. If it's about helping you think of 10 questions for a podcast or anything like that, it is a really, really good tool. I think one of the things that I would just say is that I always do in all of my talks is emphasize, like, principle number one to everyone about this stuff is own your own work. There isn't, like, at no point in the last 20 years have I ever heard anyone say, when they, like, if they wrote a really bad email, they're not blaming Outlook for it, right? If someone writes a really bad press release using AI, that's the person's responsibility to have reviewed it, made it good, right? Like, that's why it's important for them to know what it can and can't do, and to know the importance of, like, owning their own work. In this case, it's a technology tool. It's not replacing the work yet. And this is another reason why I think even people like in associations this is like a really important decision point for them. Yes, there's the surgery use case, don't use. There's the writing a first draft of a memo use case, do use. There's stuff in the middle that get harder, right? So, like, if you want to have it look through your website and your entire knowledge base and then create a public facing chat tool so your members can come in and ask questions about best practices around whatever your association's focusing on, that's where that's fuzzier, right? There are some people who are going to have a risk tolerance that says absolutely no instances of, like, there can be no output of this that gives information that is confusing or in the wrong tone. That level of risk, that way of thinking about risk, you probably don't want to be using it yet. If the risk is a little more lenient, maybe you do. And a lot of this has to do with how good your procedures are to get it there, right? You have to have a really good base of data. You have to have testing procedures, like, to make sure that any updates to that data aren't pushing it in directions that veer away from the tone that you like, that veer away from the facts that you like, that are real, you know?
Yeah, I really like what you're saying. I mean, essentially, you're kind of looking at opportunities on a risk continuum as opposed to just binary on or off. And you're saying, hey, this is the high risk, medium risk, low risk, and various positions in that continuum. And depending upon that, you like you would do with any other technology or any other business process change, you kind of evaluate the opportunities a little bit differently. You test them differently. I think the use case you described about public facing chat is a really fascinating one. And on the one hand, you want to say that you will not get anything wrong, full stop. On the other hand, we know very well that our customer service agents are not 100% correct 100% of the time. Even our very best ones are accurate most of the time, and most being a very high percentage. But we also have, especially in larger customer service organizations, plenty of customer service reps that aren't our A+ players. And so, the question that also should be asked, I think, is what's the bar that we're trying to get over versus 100% perfection? And this is one of the things I think with computer programs where people are assuming 100% perfection, 100% correct outcomes. You wouldn't allow an ERP to go production if it wasn't 100% right, basically on inventory, let's say, or on financial statements, as the example I made earlier. But in the context of humans, none of us are 100% correct, certainly 100% of the time. So I think it's just one of the interesting things to think about, because what's the acceptable risk tolerance, to use your terminology or your framework, and then also, like, what are we trying to beat? Like, what's the current level of capability we have out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would actually say people are deploying ERP and CRM tools that are imperfect every day.
Very true. Yeah.
Because it's in both cases, those tools, whether it be an AI chatbot or an ERP, they're 100% reliant upon the data that is in the system being correct. And so, again, I think as a CIO, well, 2 points. One, as a CIO, it's like really important to make sure that as you're implementing these strategies, you are doing so with a very careful, like the data matters so much, right? And making sure that the data is good is like foundational to any of these things. But then to your other point about, the people that you're calling aren't going to get it right. People might be expecting 100%. Well, maybe if you, it's a question of like how you measure those things, right? Like, and I don't think anyone has an answer to that. And again, I think it really has to be very context specific, but thoughtful. Right. Like I think you've got to like understand how it works and be thoughtful about what you're getting and what you're not.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And I think every organization is going to have a different rubric for how they evaluate these things. And that's ultimately really important because there's different levels of stakes too. So you might have a customer service bot that deals with things like membership renewals and event registrations. And then you might have a different bot, perhaps not a different bot, but a different kind of mindset towards, let's say, expert domain content. So you mentioned surgery. So if you were a surgery association, you might have a different mindset around the degree of quality you'd expect out of a bot that would answer domain questions about surgery versus administrative questions about membership or event registration or call for speakers, things like that. So that's another way to also think about it is, can we compartmentalize the problem and get some experience with lower stakes subcategories within a particular area? We might find public facing chat really interesting, but maybe we're not ready for the higher stakes types of conversational AI there. I think there's lots of ways to slice this and experiment. One of the things I always think about when I'm obviously an AI optimist, or I wouldn't be doing the type of work that I'm doing, but I'm also a realist in that I think there's lots of risks. There's lots of problems we have to be very thoughtful about around safety, around privacy, around security, around ethics, that we spend a lot of time thinking about. But ultimately, in the macro sense, the quote that I always come back to, and I don't know where this came from originally, a lot of people have been attributed with it, is that essentially if the rate of change over time externally exceeds the rate of change internally, opinions don't really matter and you're obsolete, over time. That's not tomorrow, but over a period of time, whether that's 5 years, 10 years, et cetera. And so I think ultimately that's the question, is like, how do you balance all of the downside risk mitigation in whatever subcategory there versus the need to, not only keep up, but hopefully lead in some areas?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I share your optimism. I share some practical, some of the realism as well. I share the realism as well. I do think that, we know, I think it's fair to say we know that this technology is one of the big events of the last 25 years or last 100 years in technology. It is here to stay. I think the path it goes down is not 100% visible to everyone, or we'd be making a lot more money. But this is a game-changing technology. How we can debate, does that game change 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whatever. But we believe that, I certainly believe that it's better to, as long as you establish your security parameters around things like this, it's better to be working in a way that accepts that change and lets us lead that change, right? And at the chamber, right, we're leading it from in the government and policy business perspective. And I also think that it's appropriate and smart for us to be leading it in what we do internally. It's just sort of part of it's the nature of the organization we want to be.
Bill, in talking about those practical applications that we were speaking about at the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned two things which I think were really insightful about empowering employees to experiment smartly, but also empowering them to manage risks. And I think in terms of experimenting, I love your ideas around bottom-up change and having workshops and really empowering employees to experiment on their own. But in terms of managing risk, I imagine that would be more of a top-down approach in terms of having AI guidelines or do's and don'ts. And that's something that people speak to us a lot about is, do we wait on the AI experimentation until we can create guidelines? Do we do those kind of in parallel? So I'm wondering if you have any insights around AI guidelines that the chamber uses, or maybe when you lead your workshops, things like that you share with employees to empower them.
Yeah, I think about it thank you. I think about it in terms of policy, principles, and then people, right? Because, and I'll talk about all three real quickly. So on the policy side, I think it's absolutely imperative that people have policies that align with what their approach and risk are. That's just sort of like, it is, again, foundational to running an organization. And so, yes, whether you have a separate AI policy that explains how you can use AI, what tools are approved and what tools are not approved, what your procedure is for getting them approved, you should have that, and you should tie it into the other policies that you have. So you could have your own policy, or you could integrate it into your existing policies, right? If you have an acceptable use policy, for instance, maybe this is just a part of that. That's for people to decide what works best in their work. What's more important to me than just that is also the principles, right? So we absolutely publish a principles document internally that's, again, and principle number one on that list is own your own work. Use AI, and others include things like use AI ethically and responsibly. Others include other things like we already talked about, like be resilient and curious, right? It's just sort of it's not a thou shalt not kind of document, but it is this is how we think you will be successful using this. And it's iterative, right? It's not like I'm just telling everyone these things. We take feedback and we update them and we talk about them. You could do everything really, really well, working in close parallel with your legal team and your HR team and your IT team to make sure all those things are in place. That won't really matter if you also don't have that people element, which is because, anyone can go on their personal phone and do something. And like, you have to also work to educate the people to make sure that you're not in both ways, right? One is, here's what you can't and shouldn't do, and here's why. And here's what you can do, and here's how you're going to get benefit from it. So I think like you have to do kind of all three to be successful.
That's really helpful. I actually love the idea of own your work. It's so simple. Amith, I don't know if you've ever thought about that as a phrase, but it really encompasses what you're saying, which is use AI smartly, but also take ownership over what you're doing. And we're not in a place where we can just say, oh, well, that was the AI's fault, that this blog had incorrect information, or so on and so forth.
Yeah, I love that too. And, a lot of what you described in terms of principles, Bill, I think some organizations might even describe them as value statements in some ways. And, one of the companies in our family has a core value called Own It, which is very similar to what you're describing. And it embodies the same idea. The broader essence of it is essentially it's accountability, right? We take both responsibility and pride in your work. And I think that doesn't change with AI, right? Is the point you're making, is that you still own your work and you are responsible for it. So that's a key concept that I think is it's kind of easy to forget that, actually, when you're working with these tools and they're pumping out content all over the place and you're thinking, oh, this looks pretty good, so.
Yeah, that is where the analogy between that and like an email breaks down a little bit. It's so much easier to your point. Your personal feeling of ownership over something, if you didn't type the words out, might feel different. And that's why I think it's important. That's why it's worth reinforcing. That's why it's worth talking about, right? You don't spend time talking about make sure that the sum at the bottom of your budget adds up to all of your costs, right? Like that's just sort of implicit in the work, but it's less so when you're thinking about it in terms of that. So it's worth reinforcing.
The use cases a lot of people initially gravitate towards, partly because they're really powerful and partly because I think it's just like, you're looking at a blank screen when you start using these tools, is creating something from scratch. So creating an email, creating a blog post, creating an image. And I do use these tools in that way at times. I actually find myself using the tool more as an editor, where I can take a piece of content I might have already written or an outline I've prepared, and having the tool suggest improvements. And that to me it's kind of an interesting use case, because if you think about effectively the compression of the world's knowledge that's gone into these language models, they come back sometimes with some interesting ideas in terms of, hey, your outline for this article you want to write is missing 3 interesting points that you might want to consider. Or, that type of thing I find really fascinating, because a lot of times in the workflow I'm in, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't wait for someone to give me feedback on particularly lower stakes pieces of content, right? Whether it's an email or maybe just an article or something. And in this world now, I have that ability. So to me, that's an example of where you can improve quality. It's not like that isn't saving me really any time. It's actually taking me longer, but it's making my output better.
I totally agree. I totally agree. There are, to your point, ways of staring at it. Like, I will stare at a blank sheet of paper and use the tool to write something, and it will save me time. The tools are really good when the tasks are pretty generic. So like the example I always give is, as a CIO, I always have to write some, not always, I at least once a year have to write some blog post or email that explains why you should have a secure password. Right. It's just a thing. I am not a cryptographer or an expert in cryptography. So my knowledge of this space, I was a CISO for 8 years, but that doesn't mean I know anything about cryptography. I don't have specialized knowledge that goes beyond what an AI is going to know. So I could just say, write as a CIO, write from the perspective of a CIO, a note to employees explaining how to make a strong password. That's where it's not saving me 10% of time. It's saving me 90% of time in some ways, right? It's just it's huge savings. Small task, but big percentage savings. But then if I'm trying to write something like a little more thoughtful, like just earlier, I was trying to write and update an IT policy, like an IT governance policy kind of document, right? I can use it to draft some stuff, but to your point, I can go in and say, tell me 5-10 things that this is missing. Or if I'm writing a policy document about something, or a position statement or an opinion piece of some sort, I can say, write a piece that argues against this policy statement that I have. Doesn't mean I'm going to use it, but I will at least use that to strengthen my arguments throughout. That's where, when you think about the realm of where associations can be helpful, that can really use it. That's where, to your point, it's not just about the efficiency, it's about the quality.
It's interesting that, as a communication medium, storytelling is a radically underutilized, methodology, medium, technique for business communication. We are wired, to love stories and to recall stories and to tell stories, oral tradition leading to written language and all of that through millennia. But in business, we don't do that much. We're almost kind of like, it's pounded out of us, in school, to not be creative when we're doing formal business communication. And I think one of the things AI can potentially do is help us, increase our creativity, probably tell stories better, explain things, maybe add historical context. I was working on a piece the other day where I wanted to look back in time through various periods when there's been major technological innovation and societies or people or things like that have just, prevented progress or attempted to prevent progress or resisted progress. An interesting idea came up from the AI about the Ottoman Empire and the printing press. And I didn't know this, but apparently back when the printing press was, spreading all over the world, the Ottoman Empire did allow it, but they sandboxed it and said, well, you can't use the printing press for Arabic text. And the reason was actually the Calligraphers Association or Calligraphers Union said, no, we're not doing that because that's what we do for a living. And there were other reasons. There was, cultural and religious reasons why that potentially was more sensitive. And, that isn't the thing that led to the decline of the empire necessarily, but it's an interesting case in terms of progress there versus progress elsewhere, because the printing press was this mass force multiplier for disseminating knowledge and increasing the volume of content we could collectively, print and distribute and all that. And it was slower because of that, because their primary language the people in the empire spoke was one where they didn't use this technology as a force multiplier. And so in any event, I just find that really interesting, but I had no idea about any of that. And so I was, basically writing this article about AI and trying to, get ideas, and AI came up with that. And I fact checked it a little bit just to make sure it wasn't hallucinating, and it's in fact true. Anyway, I just thought I'd share that example because I love stuff like that. I think that people who read an article about something like that are more likely to remember it than just the theoretical idea of, hey, resisting change can lead to the decline in your business or whatever.
Yeah, well, what a cool use case. Two, and the B, like that's a really good story, but it's also a really good, to your point, like a great point of learning to think about where this country is today as it relates to AI, right? I mean, we have opportunity, like again, knowing that this is a thing that is going to propel business forward. It's going to generate, I think recent things have said some $13 trillion into the economy, or the enormous amount of business growth will be had from this. We still have a lot of decisions to be made about where the chamber, any number of other groups, I have not heard too many people out there arguing that there's no space for any kind of regulation, right? This should be controlled and should be managed in ethical ways. And it should have, to your point, right, those who have a real stake in the economy at the table to think about how that change is going to enable that growth and propel us forward in ways that are innovative, let us lead, and do so in a way that is responsible.
Bill, is that an area of work that the chamber is engaged in, is like AI policy, nationally or at any other level?
Yeah, absolutely. We have brilliant people just down the hall here working on this all the time. They established an AI commission a couple of years ago that has done a lot of work and produced a really impactful report in the last year. They have they're building sort of new responsible, like a responsible business, I forget the name of it exactly, but AI and responsible business commission for AI that is absolutely taking that lead. We want to make sure that, again, the US is able to lead in policy in this area in ways that we haven't in others, right? So if you look at what the country did in privacy, it didn't take that kind of lead, right? And you have a very bifurcated or very balkanized kind of approach to how privacy laws work state by state across the EU, across many other countries at this point, that makes it more complicated for businesses to innovate in those spaces. And we think this is a time when the U.S. can do it a little better and a little differently.
Makes a lot of sense. I think when we think about like regulatory frameworks or ideas, and the idea that, this is a technology that's incredibly powerful already and is going to be more powerful, because we all know that the AI we use today is the worst AI we will ever see. And it's one way to think about it, that like the power of these things is growing at a curve that we really, even though we mathematically understand the idea of exponential growth, we don't really, as a practical matter, know what that means in terms of the impact on our society and our business and the economy, jobs, et cetera. And so on the one hand, the idea that this isn't regulated seems crazy, because, you certainly would regulate any technology that's even substantially less powerful than this. And then the flip side is how do you regulate something that's moving so quickly is an interesting question. How do you do it in a way that doesn't have a side effect? Like a lot of people who've argued against regulation, have said, well, there's an issue that the early movers, which are all primarily very well-funded large companies, can effectively result in them having regulatory capture, because the bar will be so high to pass the regulatory hurdle. And then, of course, and so therefore they'd be protected, right, in the moats that they've established since they're already in the space. And then, of course, the flip side of that is if you don't regulate anything, then, what happens? So, it's I think a really interesting conversation to be had, and certainly what the EU is doing right now with their the AI Act they're having been passed now is a fascinating thing to watch too.
It's absolutely an interesting conversation to watch, and I don't want to get too far outside of what like my to the extent that it's expertise, that my area of expertise would be. What I would say though is that I do like a lot of it is regulated with existing law. Like there's parts of this that are new and there's parts of it that really aren't, right? And so there are plenty of laws that exist that do provide guidelines around this space. I think there's probably like a gap filling there's like a way of thinking about, like, there's still a lot of gaps, and we can do some like gap filling regulation as well. And all that to be said, I don't know that anyone knows exactly what this is going to turn into. And I think like creating something that presupposes one path might also create a little problem in the future too. So
for sure. Well, you raised a good point that there is an existing legal framework. There are many laws that are out there, some of which are not enforced or are mildly enforced. And, a good example is people are concerned about AI in the context of cybersecurity, certainly in the context of the internal view of how do you ensure that your information isn't shared with AI, et cetera. That's one category. But what I'm referring to is using AI as a tool for bad actors to attack you, right, more effectively. And there's the whole move, counter move, cat and mouse game that's always happened in all of these domains. That's just accelerating with AI, both good AI and bad AI. So that's one piece of it. But the idea that you need a separate law to say, thou shalt not attack me with AI isn't necessarily required, because there's already laws that say don't attack me, period. The choice of tool, right, or the murder weapon doesn't necessarily matter. It's just a matter of saying, well, that's not legal. You can't do that thing. And I think a lot of people forget that there are fairly strong frameworks in most jurisdictions that I'm aware of that protect in many of the downside risks people are concerned about. That might need a refresh. There might be some gap filling areas. But kind of, coming back to the usage of the tools, I think it's a related point is that people see the blinking cursor in ChatGPT or similar tools, and they think it can like do anything, right? It's like, oh, well, this is this magic wizard that can like do whatever I can possibly imagine. And while that's obviously not true, even if it was, it's not necessarily the best at doing everything. And so one of the comments we're constantly talking about is, hey, like, we're sitting on top of 50 plus years of digital evolution, revolution, where we have a lot of other tools. So if you want to do like math, you probably don't want to go to ChatGPT for that, because there's a lot of other tools for that, as an example. I'm curious if you've kind of encountered that, where people are like, they're thinking of it as like the Swiss Army knife. It can supposedly do anything, so therefore they forget about all the other tools they have that are more specialized.
Absolutely, and I think there's two different ways to answer that. One is, for sure, I see that. If you don't know exactly what the tool is, and it just feels like a magic box, which in some ways it is, you do think it could do more. But that's just, I think, as like a CIO, or anyone who's in this space, where it's important to just make sure, again, you're educating your business leaders and your teams to know like what it's good at. The other side of that is there's a whole lot of, to your point, we're sitting on a lot of data. Everyone's probably sitting on a lot of data that you feel like we need to figure out ways to get more value out of this. And AI is just one part of it. So we here at the Chamber have taken on an initiative to try to gain a lot more insight out of a certain set of data that we work on, that we have access to help us better serve our members through AI. And as the more and more we do it, AI is an important part of that solution. I might have thought going into this effort that AI would be more than half of the solution. It's really not. So much of this is what these so-called AI projects are very traditional data management projects. Is the data that you have organized in the right way? Are you using the right tags? Is the metadata in the right spot? Are you categorizing it and weighting it the way that you think you should? Do you understand what it is? All those things. That's such a big part of the work. And from there, like to your point, once you have that, you could do a lot with data visualization tools that AI is not good, that AI can help with. Yes, that's an area of AI that is growing a little faster than others, but your traditional tools are going to be really, really valuable. So I think, to your point, there are very few projects, especially in the association space, that I think are going to be like a pure AI project. They're almost always you can't separate data from AI. And so much of that work is going to be about just like good data. And so even if associations who are contemplating, should we or shouldn't we be using AI for X, there is no downside and huge upside to making sure that your technology organizations and your whole organization broadly are thinking about data as an enterprise strategic asset and managing that properly, it's going to make your AI projects, whether you do them now or 6 months from now or 6 years from now. So you have to get that work done before you can be good at the other thing. And so there's like no downside, huge upside to that type of work. Even if AI isn't the answer, even if AI evolves so much in 5 years that it's unrecognizable from today, you still have to have good foundational data.
I have a question for you, Bill, on that based on your background. So you were previously at College Board, is that correct?
Yep.
And I read in your bio that you built and led an information security program designed to protect the data of over 100 million students, parents, educators, so on. What were some lessons, I'm sure there are many, that you learned from that process that you would want to share with our listeners based on kind of what you just said about focusing on your data, regardless of whether you think AI is something you should be using right now?
Yeah, I mean, I know we certainly don't have enough time to talk about all those things, but a few points that I think, like, there are many experts on information security that can talk about the value of compliance and frameworks and where to use NIST and where to use other kind of tools and techniques. Things that I think really matter to me in those kinds of cases, and anyone doing the job of a CISO, is to really put practical day-to-day tools in place. Like, I would rather be doing red teams all the time than be doing some other kinds of work that are sort of like a little more policy focused. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have good policies, you have to have them, but like, the space is moving so fast. You got to get smart hackers coming at you all the time to really know where your true gaps are. A lot of like, if you have a risk profile that is anywhere close to what they had. The other thing that I just sort of say is that, like, on that space, on that side, is like, for everyone out there, data is an incredibly important asset, and most people are really tempted to capture it, but managing it matters as much. And like, no one can steal something you don't own. No one can steal something that you've already deleted, right? And no one can steal a copy of something you never made. And so just like being thoughtful about just the data you have is as important as how to defend it, right? So
yep, that is really helpful. Very impressive, your work at the College Board, it sounds.
There's a really they have a really different set of requirements over there that deal with huge amounts of data, test questions, right? They have done some world-class work to make sure that stuff is in really good shape.
Those high stakes organizations, I think, have a lot to teach. Just regular kind of administrative use cases in most associations in the nonprofit space. And I think that example is great. I was talking yesterday to a friend of mine who is a senior level exec in an IT organization in the healthcare realm dealing with clinical data. And so in his world, they're dealing with patients and health records and all that kind of stuff across tens of millions of patients, and similar type of thing, right? It's not only mission critical, but they're under attack constantly because that information is super valuable to bad actors. So I think that the organizations, your typical association that has 50, 60, 70 employees and maybe 2 or 3 people in IT, they're not going to do that. And they're not going to do a lot of those things. But perhaps some of the thought processes that go into where to focus whatever resources you do have, can really be leveraged. So I think that'd be an awesome conversation to drill into on another time too. But super interesting stuff.
I feel like we could keep going with this conversation. Any last pieces of insights, anything we haven't talked about, Bill, or advice you would want to share with our listeners, the greater association space?
A, thank you so much for just the opportunity to talk. This has been really fun. And B, I think, like, again, there is so much of the conversation, so many of the posts on LinkedIn, the posts everywhere, it really is about theory. And it's critical to have that conversation. I really would encourage others to share more very practical, tangible things about what they're doing today, and think about things in these kinds of ways, because I feel like it's probably less in your face in a lot of the conversations that I'm having. And I think it's an area, when you think about associations specifically, there is a lot people can be doing today that doesn't require big investment or large technical capabilities. And it might be harder to think about and hear those things and act upon them if there's not a lot of information being shared about them. And so I just encourage groups like what you both are doing to sort of make sure that the right people are hearing those kinds of things, because I think people could be doing more if there were just more of these examples.
It's actually perfectly relevant. Amith, you'll know, we had the same conversation this week, actually. We just hosted an intro to AI webinar for people who work at associations eager to dip their toes into the world of AI. And we ourselves were kind of talking about, well, do we focus a little bit more on theory and what AI is and how it works? Do we focus more on practical applications? We ended up doing the latter, and we've gotten some really great feedback about that webinar so far. So I think you've hit it on the head, Bill. We can encourage people to test these tools out, because in a way that's kind of the only way to learn about how they work, while of course managing risk, like we mentioned, and empowering them to experiment smartly. I think that is key. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks
yes,
very much.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks for tuning in to Sidecar Sync this week. Looking to dive deeper? Download your free copy of our new book, Ascend, Unlocking the Power of AI for Associations at ascendbook.org. It's packed with insights to power your association's journey with AI. And remember, Sidecar is here with more resources from webinars to boot camps to help you stay ahead in the association world. We'll catch you in the next episode. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep disrupting.